My best friend and I grew up in a sleepy wannabe New Jersey Central Florida town, and we were outcasts. We had met in the 6th grade when I had overheard her talking to another classmate about bionicles, which was my 11-year-old self's passion. We became best friends, and soon we were inseparable. Soon we began a gauntlet of sleepovers, birthday parties, and family gatherings. We were practically siblings. She was the first person I come out to as bisexual, and in turn, I was the first person she told about being trans. Her home life was thunderous, though. I can't say mine was any better. We often had a habit of taking refuge at each other's houses. Like I said, we became like siblings. Her father was an alcoholic, strict and prone to physical discipline, and her sister was a stuck-up girl who soon gravitated towards the hicks and jocks when we entered high school. And her mother was a vegan hippie love child held from the 80s. When I was 23, herself 22 at the time, we had another long night of sleeping over in order to let her escape yet another fight with her mother. She had recently lost her job at Walmart, and I was going into my first shift at Taco Bell the next day. On the drive home the next morning, she excitedly told me that since she now had her own vehicle, she'd be applying at pizza places that were in need of a driver, and I was pretty proud of her. It was the first time she'd hunted for a job on her own, as I'd usually been the one to coax her to apply where I was working. Not that she ever lasted very long. My first training day goes by quite well. My coworkers are friendly and try to get me to talk more. My manager likes to playfully embarrass me, he was a fat white guy, by trying to get me to talk hood to the other workers. Being a training day, it wasn't a very long shift, but I had been up early in anticipation, and this was my first day on the job in a few months. I got home around noon, informed some of my internet friends that my first day went well, and around 5 p.m. I started to wind down, drained from a good day. As I am preparing to lay in my bed, I get a Steam message. It was her lamenting another fight with her mother and asking if she could come over. Now, I had started to grow a bit wary of the fights on their end. I'd begun to repair my relationship with my own family and a few friends, and I had given her advice many times on how to better approach things. But in my infinite wisdom and eagerness to sleep, I left a message unread and I drifted off into a slumber. Around 8 p.m., I am awakened by her bursting into my room in a panic. Having just been ripped from a dream, I am groggy and disorientated. I drag myself to the bathroom to relieve my bladder, and I come back to my room to find her rocking back and forth on my bed. It is at this time I notice she is covered in blood, so I ask what happened. She informs me that she just saw someone murder her mother with a knife. My mind just goes blank. In the deepest parts of my mind, alarm bells start ringing. Isn't the rocking back and forth a bit overdramatic? Why didn't she call the police? But after all, this is my best friend. I've known her for over a decade, and we were the only two people in the world we could actually count on. So I suppressed it and go inform my sister and stepfather. My mother had passed the year prior, and it was roughly a month to the anniversary of her death, so we were all in a dark place, antisocial as always. It was the only way we knew how to handle emotional issues. When I inform my family, they immediately go to the same place as I had, though they are far more vocal about it. I offer excuses I knew myself were flimsy and return to the room with phone in hand. I convince her to call the police, and I can hear her explain the details over the phone. A man in a black ski mask. When the cops arrive, she swears up and down that it's most likely her father. They send cars over to check the crime scene and take her in for a statement, and I ride with her in the back of the cop car over to the sheriff's office. It gets to be around 2 a.m. Her sister was brought in, as was her father. I have work the next morning, and I request to be taken home by a police officer. It takes me a while to go to sleep that morning. The next day at work, I am quiet, until my manager asks me what has happened. I inform him, but I decide to work the rest of my training shift. When I got home, my sister informs me she had confessed. Her mother threatened to kick her out for not being able to find a job, and in a rage, she had taken a kitchen knife and stabbed her repeatedly. My mind froze like a bad computer, and I turned to face my monitor. I was in a Discord call at the time, and all I could weakly say is, my best friend confessed to murdering her own mother, before hanging up and laying on my bed. Her last trial was the 7th of this month. I don't know the results, though my grandmother tells me she took a plea deal for life in prison rather than the death penalty. Part of me wants to contest that, to demand that they take the death penalty for ridding the earth of such a peaceful and caring woman's shadow. A larger part of me is just glad she's being punished. I had a very creepy friend. We'll call him Ben. I believe he might be a dangerous psychopath, or even worse, a serial killer. Ben and I met on Facebook in 2014, and he came to meet me in Romania in the summer of 2015. He seemed a little bit odd, but otherwise okay. One strange thing about him is that while he was at my house for a week, he didn't bathe for some odd reason, so he stank really bad. So I show him around Transylvania, and we both rent an apartment in Bucharest before his departure. We hang around Bucharest and he leaves. Our friendship continues online, and in 2016 I moved back to Canada. In May of that year, I fly over to Vancouver to hang out with him. Now, it is important to know that this guy is a major gun nut. He collects a lot of firearms and claims to have briefly been in the Canadian Army. He also claims he worked as a mercenary and was in Georgia during the Russian invasion in 2008. He claimed to have shot 2 people there and also suffers from PTSD. When I get there, his apartment is filthy. I'm talking trash everywhere. And there were 2 cats that made the place stink of cat piss. The guy kept his lights on 24/7, and on his wall was a clock that played a loud tune every hour. His behavior towards me while there was somewhat disrespectful, but I just took it as a buddy messing around with me. He said mildly creepy things, but again, I brush it off as him being a prankster. I leave, and again our friendship continues online. During this time, his conversations with me became darker and more hostile, in a passive-aggressive sort of way. Ben is also a hardcore alcoholic who drinks until he passes out. He does all sorts of antisocial and downright vile things while drunk. Also during this time, 2016 to 2017 period, he said that 2 men briefly lived with him for a short time. When I'd press him about what happened to those 2 men who lived with him, he changed the subject quickly, almost always. After what happened in 2018 when I last met up with Ben, I have a strong suspicion that something bad might have happened to them. So fast forward to 2018, and me and my parents are driving to Vancouver from Calgary. Perfect time to meet up for a day or two with Ben. But that turned out to be a big mistake. Ben is traveling from Kelowna to Vancouver, and we meet up at a bar near his house. We had a few drinks, and he goes home for the night. The next day, we meet up, and his behavior towards me is disrespectful in a passive-aggressive way, and also extremely creepy. We go to his workplace, and he's very subtly disrespectful to me and his coworkers. He's putting me on the spot and trying to make me look stupid to everyone around. He was a supervisor, so most of the people underneath him were too complacent or afraid to say anything. This man is obviously a psychopath. This is where it gets to a point where I believe my life was in danger. We go back to his place, and he's drinking a beer and I'm rolling a joint. The movie is playing in the background, and Ben is getting pretty tipsy. He's basically now adopted a speech pattern in our conversation where I feel as though I'm being interrogated and toyed with. He's playing a video game on his computer and I'm watching a movie. By this time, I'm feeling very uneasy and my gut instinct is telling me to leave. Generally speaking, you should always listen to your gut instinct. That primal thing inside of you is linked to fight or flight, and it's best to be obeyed. But as time progressed and as Ben was becoming drunk, he started saying very weird things. He was mumbling about, "I don't care for anyone but myself. I don't give a shit about people." There's also a loaded shotgun beside the table. He looks at his computer screen and starts mumbling about being a madman with a gun. A few minutes later, he turns to me and says, "Hey, what if I put some MDMA in your drink?" Followed by, "Yeah, haha, I'm just kidding." So the cat and mouse game continues. He's now talking about knowing a guy who is HIV positive and how he's going to get the guy to give him an infected needle to infect himself with HIV so he can live on government benefits for the rest of his life. This guy is absolutely unhinged. I'm sitting there in disbelief at just how vile this guy really is. I want to leave, but I also don't want him to know I'm ready to go. It was an awful, vulnerable feeling. He has another beer and turns to me. I'm now extremely uncomfortable. The talk is now about food. He turns to me and looks me straight in the eyes and asks, "So, if this was your last meal, what would you have?" The look on his face was one of stone-faced sincerity and malice. I absolutely knew I had to leave. My heart is pounding. I needed to make my move. With adrenaline rushing through my body, I tell Ben in a very calm manner that the weed I had is making me feel funny, and that I think I need a breath of fresh air. I quickly put on my shoes and leave before he has any chance to stop me, He makes me promise I'll be back. I go down the stairs into the sunlight. I feel like an animal that just escaped slaughter. The place I'm staying at is not too far from Ben's house, and I'm wise enough not to tell him where I'm staying at exactly. I start walking, feeling like I just escaped death. The phone rings, and Ben is asking where I'm at and that he's panicking. I tell him I'm just taking a breather. Meanwhile, I get to my cousin's house. I somehow manage to get inside. Night has fallen. The guy is calling my phone constantly. When I finally answer, he's trying to get me to meet up with him and go for a ride. The tone of his voice is flat and fake. He says that we've just had a bad night, and he's desperately trying to get me to go for a ride with him. But in turn, I blocked his number, and I blocked him on social media. That was the very last time I spoke to that scumbag. In our many online conversations over the years, Ben would drop clues here and there about his past. That he did horrible things during his supposed gig as a mercenary. He would go on drunken tirades about being a bad man, having done bad things. He was going to AA meetings and trying to put on a facade of normality by volunteering at an old folks home. Deep down, I think he's a psychopath, and a potentially dangerous one at that. And I just hope he's never murdered anyone, other than the 2 people he allegedly shot while on combat duty. Vancouver is a sketchy place full of missing people, so I guess I'll never know. I think my high school best friend was involved in a murder. Let's call her Sam. All throughout high school, and even for a bit afterwards, we were best friends. Even though we were best friends, I felt like I didn't really know her, if that makes sense. We were pretty wild teenagers, drinking, smoking, and hanging out with older guys. Sam always dated super sketchy guys. When we were 16, Sam started dating a 27-year-old named John, which was disgusting, I know. I had my fair share of dating guys that were too old for me as well, though, so I didn't see anything wrong with it at the time. Also, predators have a special way of making you feel like there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. I had my fair share of trauma due to older men from that time in my life, but that's a story for another time. She didn't have a car at the time, so she would regularly ask me to drop her off at his place to hang out and cover for her if her mom contacted me, because this relationship was obviously being hidden from her mom. Being an idiot teenager, I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. She's my homegirl, and I know she'd do the same for me. Plus, I had met John several times before, and he seemed decent enough at the time. Please keep in mind that I was also a teenager, and obviously I didn't realize that he was a predator until now. He would give us alcohol and stuff and would invite us over to party with his equally disgusting friends. The relationship seemed fine at first, but it quickly turned toxic within a few months. He would constantly demand to track her phone location and control what she wore. He also cheated on her multiple times, but she always stayed. During the time this happened, I stopped driving her to see him. One time, she called me begging me to drive her to see him. I said no, but she went on to complain that he was drunk, and if I wouldn't, then he would pick her up, and if they got in a crash due to drunk driving, it would be my fault, so I drove her to his house. I was furious with John at this point for hurting my best friend, and I had a rebellious teenage, give no fucks attitude. So, as soon as I walked into his house to drop Sam off, I started screaming at him for being a manipulative piece of shit. His response and the dark, twisted, yet emotionless look in his eyes still gives me chills to this day. "I could break your neck so easily," he said. Thankfully, I was standing right by the door, so I ran out to my car and immediately sped off. The next couple of years are kind of fuzzy. Also, I asked Sam to stop talking to me about John because I was sick of hearing about him. But basically, they were constantly breaking up and getting back together. Sam dated a string of other guys between that time, but would always cheat on them with John. When we were 18, this is when things started getting progressively weirder, and I started to distance myself from Sam because of it. Long story short, Sam had a new boyfriend who she seemed absolutely crazy about, and I was so relieved because she finally seemed over John. Then she heard through the grapevine that John got engaged, and she became irate. We were hanging out when she heard the news, and she was like, "I just have to go home and process this." So she immediately left, and I was like, whatever, I'll give her space. She calls me a few hours later and was talking super fast and laughing a lot. I was like, "Are you good?" She was like, "Yeah, I just broke into John's apartment and smashed all of his shit. I know that I have this new guy I'm dating, but I've been hooking up with John still. Don't hate me, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you. But anyway, I feel so great, and I broke his TV and cut up all of his sheets. Too bad John and his fiancée weren't home." I'd never seen her act like this before, and I was just alarmed. What would she have done if they were home? The break-in was never reported to the police because she told John it was her. And if he went to the police, John's fiancée would likely have found out that he was cheating on her with Sam. Now at this point, a smart person would completely cut her off, but I didn't. I did stop hanging out with her as much, and we naturally grew a bit distant because I had moved across the country for college, but we would text and FaceTime every couple of weeks. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, so what about the murder? Hang tight, we're almost there. In 2018, John's fiancée was found dead. The police immediately ruled it as a suicide because there was a note and the gun was found in her hand, but all of her friends and family insisted that she would never do that. I know this because I had a few mutual friends with his fiancée, and it was understandably all that anyone could talk about. She was known to everyone as being extremely positive and cheerful. They pressured the cops to investigate more, and lo and behold, 1 year later, John was found guilty of murdering her. He's currently in prison, and it gives me chills to the bone knowing that I was in his house on multiple occasions and used to frequently hang out with him. So now, moving on to why I think my friend may have had something to do with it. Last year, she was visiting my city and asked to meet up for dinner. I was like, sure, why not? We're going to be in public and I do miss her and it would be nice to catch up. While we were at dinner, she had her phone on the table and I saw a call from the name, Jail, ringing into her phone. She quickly excused herself to take the call and was gone for a couple of minutes. When she got back, I was like, WTF. She explained that she visits John in prison regularly and they talk on the phone every day. I was like, why? He was found guilty of murder. Why would you want anything to do with him? And she looked me dead in the eyes with a look of pure evil and malice and said, I'm the only one who knows what actually happened. Nobody else knows the full truth. I quickly changed the subject and finished my dinner really quickly, and I made an excuse to leave. I was feeling terrified at this point and I had no idea what she was capable of. I hightailed it back to my apartment and blocked her on everything, and I haven't spoken to her since. I know this isn't solid proof that she was involved, but her past behavior, with the break-in, coupled with that chilling comment, and the fact that she regularly visited a convicted murderer in prison, leads me to believe she had something to do with it. At the very least, she knows much more than she's admitting.